reciters whose training later involved male teachers in formal institutions. The foundational layer of learning was domestic and feminine. The authority of these women lies in their role as transmitters of correct pronunciation, proper rhythm, and ethical comportment. They are the ones who correct mistakes, enforce repetition, and cultivate the discipline required for memorization. Through these practices, they shape not only individual piety, but collective standard of what counts as good recitation. This brings us to a broader historical frame. Women's role in Quranic transmission in Hausaland and Borno did not begin in the 20th century, nor with modern schooling. It is deeply rooted in the intellectual history of the region and in the structures of Islamic learning that developed there over centuries. The most famous example, of course, is Nana Asma'u, the daughter of Sheikh Uthman Danfodio, the founder of the Sokoto Caliphate in the early 19th century. Nana Asma'u was a scholar, a poet, and Quran teacher, fluent in Arabic, Fulfulde, and Hausa. She composed poetry, translated classic texts, and organized networks of women educators. Through her system of itinerant women teachers, the Entaru, she institutionalized female religious instruction, sending trained women to villages and households to teach Quran, theology, and ethics. These women function as authorized transmitters of knowledge, responsible for ensuring that religious instruction reached women and children who might otherwise remain outside the formal circuits of male scholarship. Their pedagogical authority was grounded in mastery of the Quran, familiarity with Islamic sciences, and moral reputation within their communities. What is important for our purposes is not simply that Nana Asma'u was exceptional, but that her work formalized and expanded a pedagogical pattern that already existed. Women teaching women and children, transmitting religious knowledge through voice, memory, and moral example. These networks created chains of oral transmission that paralleled male scholarly lineages, even if they were less visible in written biographical dictionaries. They also demonstrate that the gender division of religious labor did not exclude women from authoritative roles. Rather, it located their authority in pedagogical and domestic spheres that were nonetheless central to the reproduction of Islamic knowledge. Fast forward to the contemporary period, and we see both continuity and transformation. In Kano and just today, women are Quran teachers in multiple institutional forms, in traditional Makaranta Allo, in Islamia schools, in Tahfiz centers, in Sufi circles, in reformist study groups, and in private schools established and run by women themselves. Many are known locally as Malama, a title that mirrors the male Malam, or other carry the title of Hafidha in Hausa Gwana, marking complete memorization of the Quran and conferring significant religious prestige. These women teach not only girls, but boys, especially at the foundational level. The correct pronunciation, drill tajweed, supervise memorization, and cultivate what is locally called tarbiyah, moral and bodily discipline. Their classrooms, whether formal or informal, are sites where the Quran is inscribed into bodies through repetition, posture, breath, and tone. Their authority is not derived from formal legal office, but from mastery of sound, ethical reputation, and social trust. In other words, they embody a form of Islamic authority that is sonic, pedagogical, and relational. The sonic authority is crucial for understanding the later controversies surrounding women's public recitation. It reminds us that women's voices have long been integral to the formation of Quranic subjects and to the maintenance of correct recitational standards. They are not marginal participants in Islamic soundscapes. They are among their primary architects. This is where my argument begins to take shape. If women have always been central to the transmission of the Quranic sound, how did their voices come to be reimagined as problematic? How did an instrument of piety become recorded as a site of danger? And why does this anxiety crystallize so sharply around public recitation, competitions, and media? To answer this question, we need to move from the social history of transmission to the theology of sound itself, because the tension is not simply about gender. It is about what sound does, how it moves bodies, shapes emotions, and produces forms of presence that demand ethical regulation. In Islamic thought, the Quran is not merely a semantic text. It is a recited revelation. The very word Quran means recitation. The first command to the Prophet ﷺ is not read silently, but recite. The science of tajweed, the discipline of measured and beautiful recitation, is not an aesthetic luxury. It is a form of ethical precision. To recite correctly is to give each letter its right, to embody divine speech through breath, tongue, and chest. The voice becomes a moral instrument. This is why listening to the Quran is described in the tradition as transformative. Hearts tremble, skins shiver, tears flow. Sound moves the body before it convinces the intellect. In this sense, the Quran is a technology of affect. It acts upon the senses to produce ethical and emotional states that are integral to faith. And it is precisely here that gender enters the picture. If recitation is powerful because it moves hearts, then the question arises, who is authorized to wield that power and in what spaces? When women recite beautifully and when their voices circulate beyond the domestic sphere, on radio, in competitions, and in public gatherings, they participate in the same affective economy as men. Their voices too can move, calm, inspire, and unsettle. And it is this capacity to affect that becomes the object of regulation. In the next part of the lecture, I will turn more explicitly to the theology and ethics of sound in Islam, how recitation is understood as embodied revelation, how beauty is religiously mandated, and how juristic discourse gradually shifts from regulating intention and comportment to regulating audibility itself. From there, we will move into the Nigerian case of women Quran competitions, reformist movements, and what I call the politics of vocal nudity. The moment when the female voice, once celebrated as pious, is reclassified as potentially indecent. But I want to emphasize before moving on that the starting point of my analysis is not prohibition, but transmission. Women's Quranic voices are not a recent intrusion, as I have mentioned before. They are foundational to it, they are foundational to the religion. And the controversy emerges not because women suddenly began to recite, but because their recitation began to be heard in new ways, in new spaces, and by new publics. Let me now move. So I'm now moving from place and transmission to the theological and ethical status of sound itself. Because without understanding what recitation is in Islamic thought, we cannot understand why the female voice becomes such a charged side of regulation. In Islamic thought, the primary mode of the Quran is recitation rather than silent reading. I mentioned that, and classical scholars insist that revelation was given in wording and in meaning, not as abstract sense, later clothed in human language. The Quran, from its origin, is sonic, and this is why memorization, hifz, and recitation, tilawa, have always been privileged modes of engaging the text, and why chains of transmission historically rested as much on oral mastery as on written preservation. Recitation, therefore, is not simply a means of transmission, but an act of worship in itself. Tajweed, the science of proper articulation, is not an aesthetic embellishment. It is a moral discipline. Each letter has rights, حقوق al-huruf, the mouth, the throat, the lungs, and the diaphragm become ethical sites. The body is trained to host divine speech. In this sense, recitation is an embodied ritual in which the human voice is disciplined to conform to a divine order. Sound is not secondary to meaning. It is one of the primary modes through which meaning becomes effective in the world. The tradition goes further. Not only must the Quran be recited correctly, excuse me, it must be recited beautifully. The Prophet is reported to have said, "Beautify the Quran with your voices." Beauty here is not entertainment or artistic self expression in a secular sense. It is a theological category tied to the perfection of revelation and the proper affective response to it. The Quran itself repeatedly describes its impact in sensory and emotional terms. Modern scholars of Islam and sound have described this as an acoustic epistemology. Knowledge is not only grasped intellectually, it is absorbed affectively. The ear becomes a moral organ, and through repeated listening, subjects are trained to experience humility, fear, hope, and longing in relation to divine speech. In this framework, recitation, as I mentioned before, is a technology of the self. It disciplines attention, shapes emotional repertoires, and produces forms of embodied piety. And this is crucial for understanding gender. If sound is powerful because it moves heart, then recitation is not a neutral act. It produces affect, attachment, humility, fear, longing, and moral responsiveness. And whatever affect is recognized as spiritually potent, it becomes an object of ethical regulation. The question is no longer simply, is the content correct? It becomes, what does this sound do to the bodies and souls? And how does it circulate? And what kinds of emotional and moral states does it generate? In early Islamic history, women's voices were not excluded from this sonic economy. When women transmitted the Quran and Hadith, taught men, corrected male companions, and participated in public religious life in ways considered appropriate, dignified, and morally proper in their social and religious context, the wives of the Prophet Muhammad, especially Aisha and Salama, were authorities whose voices were heard and whose speech shaped law, theology, and communal memory. Their teaching was not silent or hidden. It was publicly acknowledged and widely transmitted. The concern was not that women spoke, but how speech was framed, with what intention, and within socially and religiously recognized standards of modest, respectful, and ethical behavior. The Quranic verse that later became central to discussion of female voice, "Do not be soft in speech, lest one in whose heart is disease should be moved with desire. فَلَا تَخْتَأَنَ بِالْقَوْلِ فَيَطْمَعَ الَّذِي فِي قَلْبِهِ مَرَضٌ," does not prohibit women's speech. It regulates a style of vocal modulation associated with flirtation or seduction. Classical exegetes consistently interpret it as a matter of intention and comportment, not ontology. The voice itself is not declared illicit. Its ethical orientation is what is at stake. Yet over time, a subtle but significant shift occurs. As legal and moral discourses attempt to guard against temptation, they move from regulating intention to regulating exposure. Over time, the language of aura and protection is extended beyond the body to the realm of sound. The concern shifts towards audibility itself. It is important to state that there is no consensus in classical jurisprudence that the female voice is aura in itself. Most jurists explicitly state that a woman's ordinary speech is permissible and that women may teach, testify, and engage in public transactions. The debate arises around beautified voice, melodic modulation, and mixed gender publics. And even there, opinions diverge. Some emphasize the responsibility of the listener to discipline desire and maintain moral focus. Others place the burden on the speaker to avoid producing moral temptation or social disturbance by limiting audibility or modulation. What interests me analytically is not simply which opinion won, but how the very problem is framed. One sound is recognized as effective, and once affect is recognized as morally risky, the female voice becomes a site of projection. It is not that women uniquely possess affective power. Men's recitation also moves hearts and produces tears. But in gendered moral imaginaries, women's bodies and voices are more readily associated with temptation, vulnerability, and disorder. The anxiety is not about sound as such, but about what sound, when produced by a female body, is imagined to do. This is where broader cultural notions of modesty, sexuality, and respectability intersect with theological concerns about affect. Discussions of women's voices thus intersect with wider reflections in Islamic ethics on how sound and hearing can influence emotion, attention, and moral comportment in public settings. This brings us back to Nigeria. In Kano and Jos, women have long been reciters, teachers, and memorizers, as I have mentioned, and their voices have shaped children's tongues, disciplined communities, and animated devotional life. They have been central to the reproduction of knowledge, Quranic knowledge, and to the cultivation of correct recitational practice. Yet in the late 20th century, new institutions and technologies emerged that changed the scale, reach, and social meaning of recitation. Chief among them are Quran competitions, broadcast media, and later digital platforms. These developments created new publics for Quranic sound. They amplified voices, gathered large mixed audiences, and subjected recitation to formal evaluation by judges and to circulation beyond local communities. Recitation was no longer only a pedagogical or domestic practice. It became a public performance of piety, embedded in national religious cultures, and in some cases in state-sponsored events. For many, this expansion was not a source of pride and a sign of the vitality of Islamic learning. For others, particularly within certain reformist movements in northern Nigeria, it provoked deep unease. The same sound that was celebrated as devotion in private settings was reclassified as a potential source of moral temptation and social disturbance when publicly amplified and circulated. The concern was not about the correctness of recitation, but about its effective power in mixed gender publics. It is in this context that the notion of vocal nudity begins to take shape. The idea that the female voice, when beautified and publicly audible, becomes analogous to bodily exposure. This is not primarily a textual argument derived from explicit scriptural prohibitions. It is an ethical and sensory argument grounded in anxieties about affect, visibility, and the management of desire. Sound is treated as a form of unveiling, and audibility as a form of presence that must be carefully regulated. What we see then is a reconfiguration of authority through sound. Recitation is no longer only a matter of mastery and piety. It becomes entangled with visibility, mobility, media, and gender politics. Women's voices are not questioned because women lack knowledge or competence, but because their knowledge, when voiced, enters new acoustics and social spaces and produces effects that are imagined as morally dangerous. In the next section, I will turn more directly to these public arenas, Quran competitions, radio and television programs, and large religious gatherings, and examine how reformist movements, state institutions, and communities negotiate the audibility of women's recitation. I will then explore the strategies women themselves develop to navigate these constraints and conclude by returning to the broader theoretical stakes. What a sound-centered approach reveals about Islamic authority, gender, and the politics of the census. Let me now briefly turn to where these tensions becomes more visible, public platforms and Quran recitation, as I've mentioned. So beginning in the mid-1980s, Nigeria witnessed a remarkable expansion of Quranic recitation competitions at local, state, and national levels. These competitions were modeled in part on international musabakat in Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, and other parts of the Muslim world, but they quickly took on distinctively Nigerian characteristics. They became major religious events attended by large audiences, broadcast on radio and television, and sponsored by state governments, religious organizations, and wealthy patrons. They were also embedded in broader projects of Islamic revival, moral reform, and the public performance of piety in the post-colonial nation state. In this new institutional setting, recitation was transformed from a primarily pedagogical and devotional practice into a publicly evaluated performance. The voice was amplified, standardized, ranked, and rewarded. Judges assessed precision of tajweed, mastery of qira'at, melodic control, and composure. Prizes included scholarships, international travel, Hajj pilgrimage packages, substantial cash awards, jewelry, plots of land, and expensive cars, along with wide public recognition. Reciters became symbols of moral excellence and representatives of their families, communities, regions, and the nation itself. For young women, for young men, these competitions offered a path to prestige, religious authority, and social mobility. Success could lead to careers as professional reciters, teachers, imams, or mosque officials. For young men, they offered something historically unprecedented in scale and visibility: public recognition of Quranic mastery. Girls who had memorized the Quran, mastered its rules of recitation, and cultivated disciplined, beautiful voices could now be heard far beyond their households and women-only circles. Their voices entered stadiums, mosques, radio studios, and national soundscapes. This moment is crucial because it marks the transformation of female recitation from a practice largely embedded in domestic and pedagogical spaces into a highly visible form of public religious performance. It is here that long-standing assumptions about gender, voice, and modesty are brought into tension with new forms of religious publicity. In Kano, where Sufi orders, reformist movements, and state institutions coexist in complex and layered ways, female competitors were often publicly celebrated. Newspapers profiled them, families took pride in their achievements, and some became well-known voices on radio and TV stations and were invited to recite at major public events, including Ramadan programs and state-sponsored ceremonies. Their recordings circulated on cassettes, CDs, and later on mobile phones and digital platforms. In this context, recitation functioned as a form of what the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu will call symbolic capital. It conferred honor, recognition, and moral distinction, not only on the reciters themselves, but also on their families, teachers, and communities. This presents a more complicated picture. Female reciters there were also highly accomplished and visible, and for many years they successfully represented Plateau State and their religious organizations at both state and national competitions. Some, including myself, competed on national stages and were recognized as part of the broader Nigerian Quranic recitation community. The later withdrawal of Izala from the Unfodio national competitions in the late 1990s was therefore not simply a rejection of women's participation as such. It emerged from a combination of doctrinal concerns, institutional disagreements with competition organizers, and broader questions about the structure and sponsorship of the national Musabaqat. As part of this withdrawal, Izala established its own parallel state and national competitions for male participants, while restructuring women's participation by limiting it to lower level and semi-public settings, often below the state level, with audiences composed primarily of teachers, female students, and only minimal male attendance. In this reconfiguration, concerns about modesty and the ethics of public audibility were certainly present, including debates about the female voice and mixed gender listening, but they were embedded within wider organizational, theological, and political negotiations over authority, legitimacy, and control of religious platforms. Women were not excluded from Quranic learning or from recitational excellence. Rather, the terms under which their voices could circulate publicly were narrowed and carefully managed. What is striking here is not simply the restriction itself, but the conceptual shift that sometimes accompanies it. In some strands of the discourse, the female voice comes to be reimagined as a side of exposure. It is at times spoken of in terms analogous to the body, and something whose public audibility requires careful containment. This logic is captured in the powerful metaphor expressed in the phrase "Sawt al-mar'a awra," often rendered as "the woman's voice is nakedness." Such language collapses the distinction between seeing and hearing, between bodily display and sonic presence, and treats sound as a form of unveiling and audibility as a kind of visibility. This is not a unanimous legal position, as I have mentioned, nor it is firmly anchored in classical consensus. As we have seen, most jurists do not declare the female voice intrinsically illicit. Yet, as a moral image, the notion of vocal nudity is extraordinarily potent. It draws on broader cultural associations between femininity, vulnerability, and the need for protection, and relocates them in the sensory domain of hearing. The ear, like the eye, is thus sometimes approached as a side of moral risk, and public sound, like public sight, as something that calls for ethical care. Importantly, the reasoning here is not only textual, it is also affective and situational. It is concerned with what kinds of sounds are permitted to circulate in which settings and whose voices are authorized to do so. The question is not simply whether a woman may recite, but where, before whom, and under what conditions of audibility and amplification. This contributes to a reconfiguration of religious authority in modern public space. Recitation is no longer a matter of mastery and piety. It becomes entangled with questions of visibility, media, institutional sponsorship, and gendered norms of presence. New platforms, competitions, broadcasts, and large public gatherings generate new forms of evaluating new sensibilities about circulation, and women's voices become one focal point of these negotiations, not because women lack knowledge or competence, but because their knowledge, when publicly voiced, enters acoustic and social spaces that require renewed ethical framing. More broadly, this moment can be understood as part of a global rethinking of how religious authority is mediated through sound in the modern period. In earlier pedagogical settings, authority was grounded in proximity. The teacher's voice was heard by a limited circle of students whose bodies, comportment, and emotional responses could be directly observed and disciplined. With amplification, broadcast, and competition culture, the Qur'anic voice is detached from these intimate pedagogical relations and projected into anonymous, heterogeneous publics. Audibility is no longer anchored in face to face transmission, but in technologically expanded soundscapes. This shift does not in itself create new doctrines, but it does generate new ethical questions. How should a voice that now reaches unknown listeners be framed, evaluated, and morally interpreted? From this perspective, concerns about women's recitation are not isolated anxieties about gender alone, but part of a wider unease about the transformation of religious sound under modern conditions. Similar debates can be observed in other Muslim contexts around female Quran reciters in Egypt, women's religious broadcasters in the Gulf, the Arab satellite space, or women's devotional performance in South and Southeast Asia, where amplification and mass mediation have altered the skill of listening and intensified reflection on affect, propriety, and authority. What is distinctive in northern Nigeria is the way these global questions intersect with local histories of women's Quranic pedagogy, reformist activism, and competition culture, producing debates that are at once deeply rooted and unmistakably modern. Seen in this light, the issue is not simply whether a woman may recite, but how religious sound itself is authorized in public. What kinds of voices are considered appropriate to address mixed audiences? how emotional power is to be disciplined, and how piety is to be distinguished from performance in a media-saturated environment. The female voice becomes a particularly visible side of these negotiations, not because it is uniquely powerful, but because it lies at the intersection of long-standing norms of modesty and new intensified regimes of public audibility. And yet, as my research shows, women do not simply accept these constraints passively. They develop a range of strategies to negotiate audibility and legitimacy. Some shift the framing of their recitation from performance to teaching. A woman may be barred from reciting on a competition stage, but may still lead tajweed classes, supervise memorization, record instructional audio, or teach online. When recitation is embedded in pedagogy, it is hard as authoritative rather than potentially distracting. The moral category of transmission legitimizes what the category of public display sometimes problematizes. Others negotiate space rather than sound. They reside in women-only halls, behind partitions, or in settings where the audience is predominantly female, even if male judges or organizers are present. In these arrangements, audibility is permitted, but visibility is carefully managed. Spatial, so physical organization becomes a means of reconciling sonic authority with norms of modest presence. Still others turn to digital platforms. WhatsApp groups, YouTube channels, and recorded lessons allow women's voices to circulate widely without their bodies being physically present. The voice becomes mobile and enduring, while the body remains locally situated. Digital mediation thus opens new possibilities for religious authority, even as it raises further questions about circulation, reception, and ethical framing. What emerges from these strategies is not silence, but selective audibility. Women are not withdrawing from Qur'anic soundscapes, they are reinscribing themselves within them under negotiated conditions. They continue to teach, recite, and transmit, but they do so in ways that navigate the ethical and institutional contours of contemporary public religious life. This brings me to the broader theoretical point with which I want to conclude. Debates about the female voice in Islam are often framed narrowly as questions of law. Is it permitted or forbidden? Halal or haram? Awra or not? My work suggests that this framing is insufficient. What is at stake is not simply legality, but authority, affect, and the politics of the senses. Who is allowed to move hearts through divine speech? In which spaces, before which publics, and under whose evaluative gaze? When women recite the Quran beautifully, they do not merely reproduce text, they produce presence. They shape ethical atmospheres. They participate in what we might call the moral economy of sound. And it is precisely this capacity to shape affect that makes their voices powerful and therefore contested. By approaching the question through sound rather than only through text, we can see that gendered authority in Islam is not located solely in legal discourse or institutional office. It is also located in bodies, breaths, rhythms, and the socially regulated circulation of voice. Authority is enacted not only through interpretation, but through audition, not only through writing, but through voicing, and not only through rules, but through the training of ears and hearts. Northern Nigeria offers a particularly rich case because it shows us both continuity and rupture, centuries of female Quranic transmission, and at the same time, intense modern debates about public piety, media, reform, and propriety. It reveals how new technologies of amplification and new forms of public religious culture can destabilize older ethical arrangements, forcing communities to renegotiate the boundaries of audibility and the gendering of religious presence. Let me end by returning to where I began, to Kanu and Jos as Quranic soundscapes. In the early morning, before the city is fully awake, one still hears women reciting in their homes. In the afternoons, one hears girls chanting in Quran schools. During Ramadan, one hears women's voices rising in tafsir sessions and supplication. Whether celebrated or contested, contained or amplified, these voices continue to carry the Quran across generations. They remind us that revelation is not only read, it is breathed, not only interpreted, but it is voiced. And in being voiced, it enters the social world where questions of power, gender, and authority inevitably arise. To listen carefully to women's recitation, then, is not only to hear a beautiful sound, it is to hear the ongoing negotiation of Islamic tradition itself between text and voice, between piety and publicity, and between inherited norms and lived devotion. So I have concluded, but I would like to go back quickly and round up with just 1 minute of my recitation that I recorded in just.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إذا وقعت الواقعة ليس لوقعتها كاذبة خافضة رافعة إذا رجت الأرض رجا وبست الجبال بسا فكانت هباء منبثا وكنتم أزواجا ثلاثة فأصحاب الميمنة ما أصحاب الميمنة وأصحاب المشأمة ما أصحاب المشأمة والسابقون السابقون أولئك المقربون في جنات النعيم ثلة.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for listening. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Please join me in thanking Rahina for the wonderful presentation. That was quite remarkable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn.
We have some time now to take some questions, so I will invite you to please, use the function, the raising hand function, or make yourself visible and raise your hand so we can get some people in line. And while you're thinking about that or finding that function, I want to say that I neglected part of my